say salt of the earth?
Well, he's more than that.
Oh, no, he didn't. What a play! No, he didn't. Oh! Chris Paul, that is not right. CP3, stop it.
This is Chris Paul's 14th year in the NBA. I mean, things could be worse. Retirement isn't imminent or anything, but he is on the verge of being one of those great forgotten players. You know, the guys we don't talk about enough, like Elgin Baylor, George Gervin. Yeah, Chris Paul has a very comfy seat with his name on it right next to those guys waiting for him. That's sad though. Like, how did we get to this point? How did we watch one of the greatest point guards to ever play this game approach the end of his career with nothing but stats to show for it? Well, I can tell you that it was not for a lack of working on his jump shot. Jump Shot Trainer is the basketball training equipment that allows you to practice your shot without interference from the non-shooting hand. With it, you'll be able to practice the same technique that professional basketball players use on a daily basis. Jump Shot Trainer promises to help you improve your shooting percentage within 30 days or your money back guaranteed. For more information, visit jumpshottrainer.com with the link in the comment section or the description. This is the unfortunate career of Chris Paul. The story of how one of the greatest to ever do it will likely leave this game empty-handed, more or less. I mean, it's a great career, but relative to the type of player he is, that's why I say empty-handed. You could say Paul's misfortune started when he was drafted by the New Orleans Hornets. Not to say that they're the worst franchise in history or anything, but certain markets just don't attract an overwhelming amount of success, and New Orleans is one of them. However, I'm not gonna reach. His career there started off on the right foot. He won Rookie of the Year, steadily helped his team get better, and they actually did end up getting him some help. By his third year in the league, the Hornets had gone from bottom feeders to a 56-win team in the West, as Paul himself was now flanked by talent such as David West, Peja Stojakovic, and Tyson Chandler. That was the year 2008, and that's really where you can say his misfortunes began. He may never win a championship given the current balance of power in the league, but he very well could have won the MVP over Kobe Bryant that year. To start with, his less talented Hornets team won one less game than the eventual Western Conference champion Lakers. Second, he averaged more assists and steals than Kobe, while also shooting a higher percentage from the three-point line and the field overall. Finally, he had Kobe Bryant beat in just about every important advanced stat you can think of, including value over replacement, win shares, defensive win shares, offensive win shares, the plus minus. Look, I'm not flat out saying that he deserved Kobe Bryant's MVP, but the argument is definitely there, and it's always tough for a player to finish as a close second in that race, especially if they go on to never actually win that award. So that happened, and then Chris Paul's next dark twist of fate came in the year 2010. See, in 2009, he'd put up his best numbers across the board while also leading the league in assists and steals with 12 and 3 a game respectively. So the expectations were that he'd get even better in what would be his 5th year in the league while still being only 24 years old. The reality, however, was that season, he'd go on to tear his meniscus when his knee collided into a camera on the sideline. So after what had been a relatively healthy NBA career, he'd play only 45 games that season as the Hornets would go on to miss the playoffs for the first time since he became an All-Star. By that point, the dismantling of his best Hornets roster from 2008 had already begun as they traded Tyson Chandler for Emeka Okafor before the 2010 season began. And so, with only one contending season under his belt by his 6th year in the league, 2011 brought the same thing it brings for so many young stars struggling in small markets. By December of that year, Paul was seeking a trade to the New York Knicks, who had acquired Carmelo Anthony earlier that year. The plan was a big three between him, Anthony, and Amari Stoudemire. Instead, Paul was dealt to the Los Angeles Lakers in a blockbuster trade that was poised to shake the very fabric of the NBA for about 30 minutes. Then the NBA decided to change Chris Paul's career and the league pretty much forever. In an absolutely ground-shaking move, Commissioner David Stern vetoed the trade for, quote, basketball reasons. The only reason they were able to do so is because at the time, the NBA actually owned the Hornets since the previous owners couldn't find buyers that would promise to keep the team in New Orleans. If that would have happened earlier on, there likely would have been nothing to stop one of the most competitive duos in NBA history from forming between Kobe and CP3. Instead, he was sent to LA's annoying brother that nobody wanted to hang out with. Again, it could have been much worse. Blake was an up-and-coming star in the league, and many of us saw those high-flying alley-oops before the first one was ever thrown. And as we expected, one of the most exciting duos ever was born on that day. The only catch was, they'd go on to be one of the NBA's most cursed duos and teams as well. They were only decent in their first season together, but in 2013, they won 56 games that was good enough to place them just 3 games outside of the first seed. Their expectations were high, but their luck was not. In the first round against the Grizzlies, Blake Griffin injured his ankle while the Clippers were up 2-1. He played only 19 minutes in Game 5 and not at all in Game 6 as the Clippers were sent home prematurely. That was a series in which Chris Paul averaged 23 and 6 on 53% shooting. But that Grizzlies team eventually made the conference finals and he just wasn't going to beat them without a legitimate co-star. Then 2014 came around, and that was the year they could have legitimately been expected to go to the NBA Finals. They added Jamal Crawford, JJ Redick, Darren Collinson. Pretty much they came back equipped with some much needed depth, and they were serious enough to give the Thunder a major scare in the second round. As a matter of fact, I point specifically to Game 5 of that series where the Clippers came within seconds of taking a 3-2 lead back to Los Angeles. That would have been pretty difficult for the Thunder to overcome. In that game, Chris Paul hit what seemed to be the dagger that put them up 7 points with 49 seconds to go, which in most cases is an insurmountable lead. And then, nothing short of magic happened. For the Thunder, that is. OKC brought it within 2 and forced a turnover on Chris Paul in a situation where he really did not need to rush. Then the shadiness started. It appeared that Reggie Jackson was fouled on the next layup attempt, but a few angles on that replay clearly showed that the ball went out on him after there was no foul call. No difference, Thunder basketball. Westbrook took his trademark three-pointer while being down only 2, and the refs called an extremely questionable foul that all but cost the Clippers the game. On the last play after he knocked down those free throws, Chris Paul was pretty clearly fouled as he lost the ball, but again, no difference. The Thunder instead take a 3-2 lead after being down 15 points, and the Clippers season ends the next game. By 2015, the West was kinda done waiting on them. Steph Curry and the Warriors had grown up, and they established themselves as favorites to win the West during the regular season. And the Clippers were anything if not consistent. They had almost an identical record as the past 2 years, and at that time they were still legitimate competition for the Warriors. That notion was only solidified after they took out the defending champion San Antonio Spurs in a Game 7 at home in the first round. But there came the curse train chugging right along. During that Game 7, Chris Paul injured his hamstring, but he toughed through it long enough to hit the improbable game winner. That picture of Tim Duncan holding Paul with tears in his eyes, that was the signal to the rest of the world that he was finally taking the next step in his career, that he truly was destined for greatness this time. And when the Clippers stole a game against Houston in the next series without Chris Paul, that notion was solidified as well, for a few more games. Then in the last hour, with the Clippers up 3-2, blowing the Rockets out on their home floor, with the home crowd ready to celebrate their first ever trip to a conference finals, Josh Smith, out of all people, magically becomes a sharpshooter. He hits 3 ultra-important three-pointers to lead a comeback and seal the win against the Clippers, which clearly took all of their momentum from that series. Clippers lose in 7. As for the second year in a row, they're prematurely ousted in a time where they could have very well won the conference. By the way, Paul averaged 21 and 10 in that Houston series, while the role players scored but shot pretty poorly. Usher in 2016, and Paul's unfortunate curse isn't even being subtle anymore. They win 53 games, and in a series where they were favorites to take Portland, both Paul and Griffin sustained injuries that caused them to miss the rest of the series. Out of everything in the world that could have happened, Paul's hand gets caught in a player's jersey as he was swiping for the ball and breaks. Don't you just hate when that happens? In that same game, Griffin got injured as well, and that was a wrap for the 2016 Clippers, who had actually came into that season fairly stacked. We're now in 2017, and Dormammu, I've come to bargain. The Clippers get into a 7-game series against the up-and-coming Jazz, in which Blake Griffin only plays 3 games because of a, you guessed it, injury. Paul averages 25 points, 5 rebounds, 10 assists, 2 steals, and shoots 50% from the field. Meanwhile, his perimeter role players all shoot 42% or below. It was a tough scene. So in 6 seasons with the LA Clippers, a significant injury to him or an important teammate ruins half of his playoff runs. And then 2 of them are all but ended by extreme long shot situations. You could not have written a more unfortunate situation in a book. But luckily, the summer of 2017 was his contract year. He could stay with LA in an organization that was clearly subject to eternal doom and failure for some reason, or he could try his luck elsewhere, and that he did. During free agency, he chose to become teammates with James Harden, which at the time was a bit questionable. It seemed like an awkward fit, but it actually turned out to be at the time the most explosive offense in NBA history. Paul himself was in the perfect situation finally. It was a time where he could sit back a little and handle other duties while playing with another guy that could pound the ball, so he didn't have to expend so much energy. Houston won 65 games and became the first seed in a conference where they had to compete with the Warriors. And yeah, we're talking about the Big Four Warriors, Kevin Durant. But they did more than just compete. they managed to put the Warriors in a position they hadn't seen in quite some time, a 3-2 series lead, and they had home court advantage, and that situation set up what was about to be a legacy-defining event for both Harden and Paul. Since our focus is Paul, after a flashy career of what seemed to always end up in disappointment, he was now one game away from being co-star on the team that would eliminate NBA history's most unbeatable roster. But we all know by now that would have been way too fortunate for Chris Paul. Once more, he injured that goddamn hamstring in one of the last plays of what was a tightly contested Game 5, and it was pretty clear from that point on that he was out for the series. And, such is life for Paul, he'd go on to not even be able to participate in the most important games of his life. Games that it's almost likely they would have won if he had been there to help. Instead, the Rockets lost the last 2 games, and in our present day, Paul is just now returning from yet another hamstring injury that's cost him a good portion of this season. Due to that fact and many other injuries, Houston really has not had it as easy as last year. And now the team he has to beat if he ever wants a title has added DeMarcus Cousins, as if last year wasn't tough enough. So essentially what we're left with, or on the verge of being left with, is a career that will never likely fully be appreciated. Most of the postseason failures have fallen square on his shoulders from the fans and the media, when most of the time it's been injury or his teammates underperforming. Nevertheless, he's 33 now, and he's got none of the accolades you'd expect from what has been one of the best players of this generation. From barely losing an MVP to injuries in the most crucial moments of his journey, this has been the unfortunate career of Chris Paul, and whether he can salvage it, oh, to hell with this motivational crap, man. We know how this is gonna go. He's in a conference with the Warriors. This is over.